Hey guys, go ahead and break out your gear. We are going to move on to presidential powers here today. Those that are actually named in the Constitution, and then later this week, probably tomorrow being Tuesday or maybe Wednesday, we'll get into some of the unofficial implied powers of the presidency as well. Okay, so let's get rocking and rolling. Okay, to start off with, um, this year's AP test is probably going to focus to a certain degree on the relationship between the branches and how each branch has an influence or has power or has leverage over the other branches. And so, when they wrote the Constitution back in 1787, the intent was that they needed to have an executive branch, right? They realized with the Articles of Confederation that simply having a Congress, a national Congress, and then relying on the states to enforce those laws wasn't going to be enough, and so they moved on to creating an executive branch. But if you look at the Constitution, um, you compare Article 1 and Article 2, you'll see Article 2 is way shorter than Article 1. And that didn't happen by accident. The thinking was that they wanted to create an executive branch, a presidency, but give that individual relatively few powers. The fear was that they would essentially be creating another de facto monarchy, and so you see far fewer powers given to the president under the Constitution than were given to Congress. So let's move on. Job qualifications, the big three. This is basic boilerplate American government stuff. You have to be a natural born citizen. The thinking here was that they didn't want you, they didn't even want to invite the possibility of divided loyalties. Okay, that if you were born in the United States, you would be loyal to the US first and foremost, end of story. You have to be 35, and then let's see, you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years. Okay, so conceivably, you could be a natural born citizen, even if you were born outside of the United States, like John McCain, for example, was born down in Panama. His dad was an admiral in the Navy, and but because of his parents were, the fact that at least one of his parents was an American, that made him a natural born citizen, regardless of where he was actually born. Okay, then you get the informal qualifications. It's awfully difficult to become president without these as well. So, for example, you have to have the ability to give a decent speech, whether it's off a teleprompter or, a written speech or, having the ability to speak extemporaneously. Different presidents have different, strengths and weaknesses when it comes to this. Obama could pretty much, hey Cole, Obama, I'm talking about Obama, could pretty much riff um, on his own as well as give a prepared speech. George W. Bush was pretty good at giving prepared speeches, but famously or infamously not very good at extemporaneous, off the cuff comments. You could make the argument that President Trump is the flip side of that. That he is pretty good, regardless of what you think of his policies, that he's pretty good speaking off the cuff, but is not the greatest when he's reading off a teleprompter. And I think we as a country, we've seen a lot of, examples of this or evidence of this. So you got to be able to communicate with the public. Um, you need to have the ability to raise money, okay, which usually means name recognition. You don't have to come into the presidency being independently wealthy, but you definitely need to have the ability to raise money. And you're certainly not going to be president if you can't do that. Think on your own, you guys. What other kinds of informal qualifications would you need in order to make a successful run for the presidency? Um, just based on your experiences and your perceptions, what do you think? What do you think you need? Uh, in order to become president. So anyway, you can shoot me your responses and remind. I know you guys did that last week, and that was fantastic. Kind of gives me an idea of who's out there and who's not. But in any case, let's move on to presidential powers now. Okay, so these are the ones listed in the Constitution, and here it's a little bit different from what we see with Article 1 with the section on Congress. Congress, has the enumerated powers. They're listed. Not so with Article 2. It's a little more of a narrative in Article 2, and so it's the powers are you kind of have to tease them out. You have to hunt for them a little bit. So what I did was I separated those powers into 5 different categories. The first being executive powers. All we mean by this is that it's the president's job to execute or implement the laws passed by Congress. Okay, so you think back to separation of powers. One branch of government makes the laws, the other branch of government enforces those laws. Okay, and we'll talk later this week about how the president actually does this. If Congress creates a policy, let's say restricting immigration, the president is not standing on the U.S.-Canada border with a shotgun, enforcing that policy. The president has other people to do that for him, and we'll talk more about that. Then we get the diplomatic and military powers. When we're talking about diplomacy, the president is the head of state. He represents the United States to the rest of the country, okay, or I should say to the rest of the world, okay. The president is responsible for creating treaties with foreign governments. Those both fall under the president's diplomatic powers. When we're talking about military powers, the president wears a different hat. I know you guys are familiar with the phrase commander in chief. And so here what we're talking about is that, the president is ultimately the country's highest military policy maker, military decision maker. And the reason for this is the framers feared, think back to factions, think back to James Madison and factions. He basically feared that the military could become one faction that might seek to undermine the freedom and the protection of the American people. And so the intent was to make sure that the military is always under the control of a civilian. Okay. And so, every president we've ever had, whether they served in the military or not, by the time they become president, they are civilians. Okay. So like even somebody like Eisenhower, or go back to the beginning, Washington, had to resign from the military before ultimately becoming president. Okay. So we get that second category. The third one, the appointment powers. What we're talking about here is that the president has the power to appoint officials throughout the federal government. Okay, so that includes federal judges. Okay, and when we're talking about federal judges, we'll get into this in the next couple of weeks when we get to the judicial branch. Federal judges include district court judges, the ones that we would actually have the most contact with. It includes appeals court judges. Those people are sometimes referred to as circuit court judges. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, if you guys remember a year and a half ago, Brett Kavanaugh, his appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, that process was initiated by President Trump. The appointment powers also cover ambassadors to foreign nations, other cabinet officials, all those cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries, and there are literally dozens of different categories, different types of federal posts that are appointed by the president. Here's where we get into checks and balances, because the president appoints these individuals, but they don't actually get their job until, and here's where you're thinking to yourself, oh, until they're confirmed by the Senate, okay, until they're confirmed by Congress. So the Senate has power over the presidency in this case. We move on to signing and veto powers. When Congress passes a bill, it moves on to the president, and the president has the option, you guys already know this from last week, of signing the bill or vetoing it. There's also something known as a pocket veto, which we're going to get into later on, probably tomorrow or Wednesday. But the intent here is that the president serves as a check on congressional powers. Okay. Let's see here. Then we move to the pardoning powers. Okay. When we're talking about pardoning powers, here this is seen as a check on the federal courts. The president has the power to pardon almost anybody who is convicted of a federal crime. Okay, who's been convicted of violating a federal law. There are a few restrictions to this. The president cannot pardon himself for a crime. Um, but occasionally, now obviously President Trump was not convicted back in the fall by the Senate. Um, but like if I think Nixon is maybe a little bit more of an illustrative case. What we saw there was Nixon obviously wasn't impeached. Okay, he resigned just before he could be impeached by the House. Um, and then in order to protect President Nixon, and he argued at the time, the country as well, what President Ford did when he became president, after rising up from the vice presidency, was he pardoned Richard Nixon for any crimes he did or may have committed. Uh, and so that was sort of like a bit of a blanket there. Now the thing is, you guys, these pardoning powers only cover federal law, right? They're not restrict. They do not protect you from state law. And so in President Trump's case, I know coronavirus and everything else has pretty much sucked all the oxygen out of the room. In the state of New York, we do have several cases working their way forward involving the president and his company and his kids. And let's say hypothetically that President Trump were to be convicted of one of those state crimes, he could not be pardoned for those. Okay. Um, Pardoning power also, it's been a little bit more prominent in this administration, but generally speaking, presidents don't really think too seriously about pardoning, convicted felons until they get into the tail end of their second term, or the tail end of their last term, whichever that might be. And because pardoning is usually seen as pretty controversial. After all, you are overriding the judgment of a jury and or a judge and all the evidence that came out in that trial. And so presidents typically don't like to do this, if they're going to do it at all, until the tail end of their second administration. When they're already on their way out the door and they're packing up their clothes and getting ready to leave the White House. Um, you don't want to pay a political price for that. Now, in the case of President Trump, he has pardoned several individuals. Obviously, this is his first term. In his particular case, his calculus, his thinking was that by pardoning these people here in this first term, what he's actually doing is he's solidifying his credibility or his credentials with his base, all right, with his Republican base. Um, it hasn't done him any good with moderates or with Democrats, but at this point, or at the time he issued those pardons, he wasn't terribly concerned with that. Okay, his major concern seemed to be solidifying his own base. But anyway, time will tell, and we'll see what happens if it ultimately winds up costing him in the November election. Okay, although I suspect voters in November will probably be thinking of other things, beyond who the president has pardoned and hasn't pardoned. But we shall see. Okay. One last note here, you guys. So I just sent out your last batch of chapter questions on the federal courts. That's going to be it for chapter questions. I know we've got 4 weeks until the AP test. Don't worry, I'm not going to abandon you. What you guys are going to get next week is a pretty comprehensive review, pretty comprehensive study guide for the AP test. The the thing with that is it's going to take you guys a while. Okay, it's going to be bigger than a batch of regular homework. It's going to seem a bit ridiculous. We're going to go all the way back to stuff from January. But if you do that, okay, if you actually invest a good deal of time and effort, and the concepts make sense, and you do a good job on this thing, I assure you, you guys are going to be over prepared for the AP test. Okay. Remember, the AP test this year is only 2 questions, 2 free response questions. One of them is more of a short answer question, and the other one is more of an essay. Like I said, if you invest some time the next few weeks, and you actually do this review, all right, and you don't shortchange yourself or do, a half measure. I promise you, you're going to be well prepared for this thing. Okay? Shoot me up. That's weird. Hit me up on Remind anytime, you guys, and keep emailing me your homework. All right, especially those of you guys who are looking to improve your grades. Okay, can't improve your grade unless you do the work, unless you turn in the homework. Have a good one, guys. Bye.